Hello again, everyone, and welcome to our live panel, where we'll be hearing from diversity and inclusion leaders about their views on workplace inclusion. We heard in the fireside chat that executives need to buy into inclusion and support middle managers to drive change. One of our key research findings was also that middle managers are not powerless, and their day-to-day decisions make a big difference whether immigrants feel included. That's why we wanted to bring together three diversity and inclusion leaders to discuss practical advice and tips on how middle managers can create and lead immigrant inclusive teams. Before we get into the discussion, I would like to give the floor to the panelists to introduce themselves. Gopal, why don't we start with you?
Everyone, my name is Gopal Bansal, and I'm the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at RBC. Glad to be here with you today.
Why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm learning development consultant with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, where I'm also a senior producer, and I lead inclusion and diversity programs across the company from manager level to frontline workers.
Us. Karen, would you be able to go next? I think there's a slight technical difficulty on Karen's side. I'll be happy to provide the platform back to you once that's overcome. I would like to start the discussion in the meanwhile as we are waiting for Karen to join us. And Gopal, my first question is to you. We had an extensive discussion in the previous sessions about the practices that executives and middle managers need to adopt. But at the same time, middle managers work with a lot of diversity groups, people of color, indigenous populations, immigrants in the workplace. And most of these groups also have intersectional identities. How should middle managers navigate intersectionality?
It's a great question, and you know, Yilmaz, it points to this growing shift that we're seeing in the diversity and inclusion field, and something that we've been seeing for quite some time. This idea that identity can be fluid. So depending on the situation or the circumstance that you're in, you will either identify with one aspect of your identity or another aspect of your identity. I think, you know, for me, it often comes down to a really simple idea. And I know this is a complex challenge and it's a complex issue, but I like to think of it in terms of breaking it down to keep it simple. And for me, the simplicity here is so getting to know the team that you have, understanding the nuances of the human being, not just the human doing, will give you a better sense of their individual motivators. It'll give you a better sense of what makes them tick, what's important to them, what their values are, and it'll help you better understand how to work with them in a way that will enable you to unlock their potential and get the best out of them. So it really is about this kind curiosity and recognizing that, you know, humans are complex creatures by nature. You know, you can use the analogy of an onion, whatever you like, but it does take curiosity for us to get to know each other. But that curiosity has to come from a kind place, and in some cases, it has to come from an educated place. So if you're aware that somebody is an immigrant from a part of the world, perhaps that's experiencing war, you know, it's incumbent on you about that before you start asking them questions about their experiences. Get some history on what has happened in the part of the world that they're from, but then be kind and be curious.
It's really powerful, especially your emphasis on talent as a human being and not just human doing. Lisa, anything to add to that?
I totally agree with what Gopal said around understanding that inclusion and diversity have to take into account much broader concepts than maybe has been the case in the past, and that's at the key to successful training, I think.
Yes, and you set the stage really well for my next question, because this is something that companies really struggle a lot, setting the right training and driving behavior change. This is an area where you have lots of expertise. And in your perspective, what are some of the key do's and don'ts of inclusion training, especially when we think about middle management?
Yeah, I having trained people both on the frontline level and at the senior management and the middle management level, that the content of the training is critical. It can't be just a high level theoretical ideas based thing. It has to really cover the granular areas that Gopal and the panelists in the fireside chat talked about in terms of the cultural competency concepts. And people have to understand that practicing inclusion needs to be done in ways that are different for diverse communities, indeed for all people. That recognizing people's unique talents is more than just assimilating people into a pre-existing way of behaving. I've developed and lead our unconscious bias program at the CBC, and that really has been a point of entry to delve into all the presuppositions that people have about how to encourage and foster talent. Because really, you have to go beyond hiring. You need to focus on supporting, as we've talked about. So I think if I had to recap sort of the do's and the don'ts, I'd say establishing the content of the training to deal with those things, making sure that the context of the training is given to participants, that they understand that it's a must-have, not just a nice-to-have, that there's a direct relationship between the training and the company's success, that good training needs to move people from awareness to action. And needs to show middle managers that there are tools within their power to do that, to take these concrete steps. It needs to project, as the fireside panelist said, that inclusion training isn't a one and done. It's an ongoing journey, and that success takes planning. It needs to be intentional and drive towards specific results. So training itself can't be theoretical. It really needs to address the practical issues that middle managers face or be perceived that they face, and give them space to explore those conversations where they're needing to move out of their comfort zone and to take on new practices. So providing an environment that says, there are no stupid questions, but we're here to support you. I think those are some of the main things that are really critical to success.
Thanks. I think that was a great summary, especially designing the content in a way that it links back to cultural competencies, and making it easier for middle managers to operationalize the training in their day-to-day lives is really, really important. Gopal, anything else to add on that? And while you are responding, I also want to for you to think about the broader diversity and inclusion journey that organizations are on. Training is one component of it, but organizations are at different stages. So where should they start?
Yeah, thanks for that double whammy, Ilmaz. I appreciate it. I think Lisa touched on a few of the components, and when we think about it, more broadly from three aspects, and I know she touched on this. So you've got the awareness, which is your training. You have the action, which is what do you actually do? How do you ensure first that people are aware, that they understand, that you're creating a common and consistent degree of understanding on a particular topic? How do you ensure that you're helping your workforce move from awareness to action? What are the strategies that you have in place, or the tactics that you have in place to help people do that? And then finally, for us, it's about accountability. How do you build in the accountability for people to live our values, drive our purpose, demonstrate inclusive behavior, recognize the role that they play individually in creating a diverse and inclusive culture? At RBC, we're quite clear about this, and I say it pretty much at every time I've had the opportunity to speak to portions of our workforce. Diversity and inclusion is everybody's responsibility at the bank. It's not anyone's, just because my team happens to do the work specifically focused on that. But every interaction that we have with our colleagues, with our clients, with our communities, with one another, with our people leaders, with our direct reports. Every one of those is an opportunity for us to demonstrate how we bring diversity and inclusion to life. As organizations think about this journey, depending on where you are in the journey, you'll start at different places. It may start from the perspective of, hey, we need to gather data to understand whether we have diverse representation or not. And then you may go to training. I think the important thing here is to recognize that, one, you should start. There's standing still is no longer an option, I don't think. And two, that there are organizations out there who have been doing this for some time who would be happy to provide you with advice and counsel. It's something that I do on a fair bit. Have different organizations call and ask as they're starting their journey on what we've learned and what some of our practices are that they might be able to lean on. But starting is really critical.
Thanks, Gopal, for that. I think the highlight on that it's everybody's responsibility is really, really important. At the same time, recognizing that that accountability is multi-layered, and executives need to act, middle managers need to act. But at the end of the day, there's all something that every employee can do to drive inclusion at the workplace. Karen, I think now we have you online. If you would be able to introduce yourself briefly.
Sure, and my apologies for that, the joys of COVID working. So I'm so thrilled to be joining the TRIAC group here and my colleagues in the I&D space. So my name is Karen Sierra, and I work at CPP Investments, leading their global inclusion and diversity efforts. I've been there for about 3 years, going on to 3 years now, and prior to that, I was at TD Bank.
Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm glad we were able to overcome the technical challenge. My question to you, Karen, is what are the most common mistakes that middle managers make when they are trying to act inclusive, and how do we avoid these?
Sure, thanks for that. I think the most common is sort of getting a little too comfortable in the way things have been done in the past. I think a lot of the times we look at what we've done well and say that's a recipe for success for the future. And I think in a lot of instances that's true. But in the inclusion and diversity space, I think, it really is the potential to unlock growth and success. And so I think when we think about inclusion and diversity, we often look backwards and say, who did this role before? How did they do it? And what made them successful? Rather than saying, what do we need for the future? What do we need to make sure that we're future-proofing the roles, we're future-proofing the opportunity, and we are really sort of thinking about what comes not next rather than what has come in the past. And so, that has an embodied form. So, we know that historically we can look at roles that were filled by a particular embodied person, and oftentimes the next person looks just like them. And that is, you can call it unconscious bias, you can call it systemic racism, you can call it whatever you want. But the fact is, that means we're still looking backwards. We're not looking forward into what we might need for the future and what skill sets we might need to be leveraging to sort of reach future potential rather than just continuing the same thing.
Thank you for that. I think it's really important, what you mentioned around the talent pipeline and going into future, how it's going to evolve, because Canada needs immigrants, but it also means fully leveraging their skills and talents to make the most of what they bring to the companies, to the society, and to the economy. Gopal and Lisa, anything to add on what Karen shared?
No, I think she did a fantastic job there.
Yeah, I agree.
That's wonderful. My next question to all of you is, what's the cost of ignoring equity and inclusion for a middle manager? We know the cost for organizations, but individually, what would happen if I don't care about diversity and inclusion? Lisa, would you like to? Yeah, okay.
Sure, I can jump in. I think we're all just waiting for who's going to speak first. So I think the cost is the potential for the success of that particular manager. I think, there's a number of intangibles, and depending on the role that middle manager plays, there could be financial costs with not being able to meet objectives or sales targets or your goals, whether they're efficiency goals or whatever the case may be. I think the bigger cost there is, others will recognize that middle manager isn't very inclusive. And I think it was Rola in the earlier fireside chat who said, people leave leaders, not organizations. And I think that's true. I think there's a lot of research that backs that up. And so if you have a leader that isn't inclusive, that doesn't value diversity, you'll see it because people will be reluctant to want to work for that individual, and you will see attrition increase, which ultimately not only creates a cost for the middle manager from having to consistently replace people in seats, but also, I know you didn't say organizational cost, but there's certainly an organizational cost there as well. And so I think there's multifacets to this, but you can't ignore the value. And the other way of looking at it is what value can you get out of a middle manager who is diverse and inclusive? And the research on this is irrefutable. It's many, many years of it. Diverse and inclusive teams perform better. They deliver better innovation, better growth. So if you're not a diverse and inclusive manager, that's the cost of what you're missing, outside of people who may choose not to work for you because of that.
Yeah, I would build on what Gopal said and say that in terms of there being a lost opportunity for specific managers, there's a lost opportunity for a corporate culture as a whole, right? If you don't have a company that is championing diversity, and inclusion, which is the Canadian story, right? That is what Canada is and how we define success now. Especially at this time of heightened awareness around issues affecting different communities, then you're really missing out on an opportunity to be a corporate leader and have values that reflect back on what Canadian society wants to be. And just building on also what Gopal said about studies, have showed that if you don't create that atmosphere around inclusion, that there are heightened intentions to quit, lower productivity, lower job satisfaction by employees. And so that will affect retention and employee churn and just reflect so badly on a company in the broader sense.
Thank you, Lisa. Karen, before I ask for your opinion, you have a great question from the audience, so I would like to pose that to you. How do you provide challenging upward feedback to your leaders to push them towards diversity? So if I'm an employee, I want my manager to act differently. How do I transmit that message?
Are you asking me then, Yilmaz, to answer that question or build on what we were just discussing?
Answer, yeah.
They're connected. If I take a step back and actually think about the question and think about what we were just discussing, I think they are intricately connected. If you have a culture of inclusion, you have a culture where people feel they can bring their best selves to work. And you're removing barriers. And that is the role of all of us, to contribute to the opportunity to remove those barriers. I do think that it would be a little motherhoody to say, find the space and find the time and, speak up for yourself. I think, there is inevitably a risk involved. There's a sort of social risk involved. There's a longer term or a shorter term risk involved in sort of being open with your feedback around non-inclusive behaviors. But I do think that there's an opportunity to own your career in that space, to say, this is the environment where I need to work in order to bring that best self to work. And so, if there's a corporate culture, just building on what has already been said, if there's a corporate culture that says we're, we are an inclusive culture, we are increasing representation of historically underrepresented groups, that to me is a real call to action for all leaders to say, I'm clearly not doing something that requires us to even make these priorities. If they already existed, we wouldn't have historically underrepresented groups. If we needed to build an inclusive culture, if we need to build it, it means we don't have a completely inclusive culture now. So approaching the work with humility is important for the organization as a whole. And my friend Ray Williams at National Bank actually said something recently to me that was, in a mentoring capacity, but he said, what's important to my manager fascinates me, right? So if we just keep looking up and saying, okay, my CEO is saying that inclusion and diversity is important, and the next level down and the next level down, and somewhere in the middle, something gets lost in translation and it doesn't sort of impact my experience, that is a call to action to say something needs to change. But as far as giving that feedback, I think allies in that space are really important, and mentors are really important to say, how do I bring this really difficult conversation up? To say, let's just put this into context. I'm not getting the professional support that I need to advance to the next level. A mentor in that space is really, really critical to say, how do I assess the situation objectively? How do I put myself into this sort of objective assessment and then give that feedback in a way that is in it, that there's something in it for both the manager and for you, i.e., the manager then is going to be aligned to their manager and their manager is aligned to their
Absolutely.
manager all the way up. And so I think that there's an opportunity to sort of work within the culture, but also just seek advice elsewhere. I'm a big fan of mentors outside of sort of my day-to-day job to sort of give me guidance and feedback and allow me to see blind spots that I haven't seen.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely mentorship is one of our recommendations to middle managers as part of the research that we just released. Gopal and Lisa, any final remarks and anything to add on what Karen has just shared?
I think. Sorry, go ahead, Lisa.
Sorry, I'll make it short. I just wanted to follow on where I really liked what Karen, you said about framing it in a way that talks about doing your best work, and I think that that's a winner. Is that anytime we can frame any of these questions for people who may not have a cultural competency around creating conditions so that all employees can do their best possible work, I think that cuts through any level. And then my last thought about all of this is just, I would encourage everybody to celebrate successes when there are successes or where there are, shared wins. So when you can build a culture of that in any workplace, it's going to make diversity not seem like a tough thing to do, but a great thing to do.
Thanks for that positive ending, Lisa. Gopal, any final words?
Yeah. I will just very quickly build on what Karen and Lisa shared. Intentionality matters in these situations. Karen touched on, is it a blind spot? So in that particular situation, was the manager being malicious or was the manager just missing something? And I think that's an important differentiator, because if they were just missing something, I think it's easier to lean into that conversation and provide that feedback and say, hi, I don't know if you know this. But when you do this, it creates this. And oftentimes, if you have a manager who's got the right intention, that will help. Closing thoughts on this, I think. Look, they touched on it in the fireside chat earlier. We know immigration is going to be so critical to the economic growth of Canada. We know the full inclusion of newcomers to Canada is going to be critical to our ongoing economic growth. And there's certainly work to do here across all organizations. And I think it's important for organizations like TRIAC to continue to push us in having these conversations and raising awareness. So I think my final word here, Ilmaz, would be a thank you to you and to TRIAC for putting the study together and inviting us on to have this conversation for something that's so important. And I know, we're 5 years out, but I think the research had showed 2026 is when we expect to see close to 100% of our population growth in Canada come from immigration. So it's coming quick.
Thank you so much, Gopal, Lisa, and Karen. It has been a pleasure talking to you today. We weren't able to cover all the audience questions, so I would like to apologize for that. But stay tuned, and in future TRIAC events, we will be continuing the discussion on diversity inclusion. And now we'll be turning to our Chair of the Board of Directors, Dr. Catherine Chandler Crislow, to deliver the closing remarks. Thank you.